Hello and welcome to the channel. We talk horror here. If that's something you enjoy, please consider liking and subscribing. We've gotten a bunch of new subscribers recently, which I'm really grateful for. I want to thank everyone for that. And with that, I thought that it might be worth it for me to make a video where I just sort of talk about my tastes, where they come from. And so I put together this list of films that are fundamental to me becoming a horror fan. Let's get into it. We're starting this list with a family-friendly film, Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island. The hard thing about doing a list like this for me is that I've always been into horror. There's not one movie that made everything click into place. I've always liked scary stories and mysteries, but growing up, they of course had to be kid-friendly. Scooby-Doo was my favorite cartoon growing up, as the Hanna-Barbera original Scooby-Doo Where Are You would regularly rerun on Cartoon Network. A little later, this would lead me to live action shows like Goosebumps and Are You Afraid of the Dark? Some of the earliest books I ever read were actually Goosebumps books. I don't know exactly when I saw Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island for the first time, but I must have been pretty young. The crazy thing about this movie is that the monsters are actually real in this one. And this is where I can sort of see the early steps in me becoming a horror fan, because I remember that really shocking me. That it wasn't just some guys in masks. I was really shocked, but I wasn't really traumatized. I was actually more intrigued by the discomfort I was feeling. This was also the first zombie-related media I ever encountered, and it's one of my absolute favorite subgenres of horror. What's been so interesting about rewatching this film as an adult is how much it's structured like a horror movie. There are a lot of comedic hijinks, of course, but at the core of this film, there is a mystery with a villain who has a rather tragic backstory. They also play around with some very well-established horror tropes in a family-friendly way, which I think is actually really smart. It makes the film really fun to watch as an adult, too. A lot of the things I compliment about this film are things I would compliment about any other horror movie. I'm a sucker for atmosphere, and this film has lots of it. The Zombie Island is located in Louisiana, and the Southern Gothic vibes are immaculate. If you haven't seen this film and you want something family-friendly, I think this is a really good time still. It holds up. I'm gonna let Final Destination be this list's representation of me getting into more teenage-based horror. I think at this point I knew I liked the genre, but I was pretty much only watching contemporary stuff that skewed a little more towards younger audiences. My main reason for picking this one is because Final Destination 3 is the first movie I remember being excited about before it coming out. This would have probably happened with Scream if I had been born a little earlier, but I just missed the boat on those films. So this is definitely the right place and right time for me, but don't let that take anything away from the original Final Destination. It's great. There's a playfulness in the horror of this movie that really spoke to my preteen brain, but every time I rewatch it now, I'm also reminded how much I actually really like these characters. Even though the film has a supernatural killer who kills people in pretty zany, outrageous ways, you have a core group of kids who are just trying to survive while mourning the loss of their friends. The through line in all of these films is that you can't escape death, but the first one actually taps into the sadness of that. Don't get me wrong, I actually love most of the films in this franchise, but I think they lost their emotional core as the series went on and on. I definitely didn't think that deep about it as a kid, but that doesn't mean the themes around death and mourning were completely lost on me. Once I actually got to see Final Destination 3, I remember liking it because it had these insane, absurd kill sequences that topped a lot of the stuff they were doing in the first two films, but I knew even at that point that I liked the first two better. Now, 5 movies in and a 6th one on the way, I still think this is a very solid franchise. I had a hard time deciding whether I should put the original Friday the 13th on this list or Halloween 4: The Return of Michael Myers. I ultimately went with Friday the 13th because it was the first horror film I ever saw that was made before I was born, thus making it my first experience with a classic horror movie. I was well aware of older films, of course. My dad would watch black and white movies all the time when I was growing up, but he was was never a horror guy. I got my hands on this movie due to my older brother's friend recommending it to me. He was a pretty big horror fan at the time, and I think he was excited that I was getting into the genre as well. So anyways, I watched this movie, and something shifted in me. I felt an obsession with 80s slashers begin. At this point, I was already the weird kid who liked punk and emo music and dyed his hair black, so this was just the natural progression of things, I think. And I bring that up for a reason. Friday the 13th felt very punk rock to me. I could tell that it was made on a low budget and so clearly made to provoke with its gratuitous violence and nudity. As I've gotten older, I definitely want a little more from films than what the original Friday the 13th has to offer, but right then and there, it was exactly what I needed. The POV being from the killer's perspective was something that grabbed my attention immediately, and then the final reveal and jump scare at the end really got me. I was pretty much hooked on 80s slashers as soon as this movie ended. I would later catch a lot of the Friday the 13th sequels on TV, and that's also where I first saw some of the Halloween sequels, way before I actually got my hands on the original. And as I said, I could have also picked Halloween 4 as my pick for this part of the list, but I think it's just because the ending of that movie was so disturbing to me at the time. We all have those scenes that stick with us from when we were young, and that's definitely one of mine. The Hills Have Eyes remake from 2006 marks another big milestone for me. This is the first film where I actually recognized someone's name in the credits, Wes Craven. So I guess this is around the time when I started to pay attention to who was actually making these films. This also led me to look up Alexander Aja's previous film before he directed The Hills Have Eyes, High Tension. I really liked this film, but its inclusion on this list is mostly because it led me to a lot of other interesting movies. French Extremity quickly became a favorite subgenre of mine, and Wes Craven was the first director I became obsessed with. But more on that later. I love both versions of The Hills Have Eyes, but I think the remake is actually the far superior version. I've always loved the energy of this movie. As soon as the cannibals attack, the pacing completely shifts as all hell breaks loose, and it never really lets up. It's so violent, so mean-spirited, yet so much fun to watch. This is a horror movie with the energy of an action film. It's really infectious. Like with Friday the 13th, I think these types of really high-energy thriller rides were what I was looking for at the time. Another thing I wanted to note before moving on is that this is the first movie I ever watched with a commentary track. I very much associate this movie with me gaining an interest for how movies were made, and that's an interest of mine that's obviously still going strong today. On the commentary track, Wes Craven talked a lot about the process of making movies in the 70s, which got me curious to check out his first horror film, The Last House on the Left. This is not my favorite horror movie ever made. It's not even my favorite movie on the list, but it is the one that's had the biggest impact on me. It was so dark, so sleazy, and upsetting that I never needed to watch another extreme horror movie ever again. I think it's important to note that I got into the genre when it was at its most mean-spirited. Movies like Hostel and the Saw sequels were all the rage, and as I previously stated, I was a big fan of the French Extremity movement. The Last House on the Left didn't change my mind completely about these things, but it did make me rethink a thing or two. I think the biggest criticism regarding 2000s horror was that it was overly violent and nasty without reason, and that's something I would probably agree with in hindsight. The Last House on the Left is also overtly violent and nasty, but it has every reason to be. Its message comes from such a dark and hopeless place that you can't help but listen to it. It's also really weird. It's such a strange film. It has these elements of comic relief that doesn't fit with the rest of the movie at all, and I think that made it even more fascinating to me. The Last House on the Left is the first movie that ever got to me in that way where I didn't know if I enjoyed watching it or not. It was disturbing. I still think it's disturbing. It's an independent movie from the early 70s, so of course there are a lot of things about it that hasn't aged great, both technically and in the way it conveys its message, but I still think it's a must-see film. There's a part of me that thinks I watched this movie at too young of an age, like I wasn't ready for it, but considering how much of a positive impact it's had on me, maybe it actually was the exact right time to get that experience. We're getting to the point in this list where I could start putting a lot of different classic horror films on here, but I've come to the conclusion that it has to be Night of the Living Dead. I know a lot of people prefer Dawn of the Dead or Day of the Dead, but this is my favorite Romero zombie film. The human drama here just makes it too damn good to look away from. Before watching it, I just knew it as the movie that popularized the zombie genre, so I was not prepared for how smart it was going to be. As I was becoming more well-versed in film, I started to gain an appreciation for writing, and I think Night of the Living Dead is such a well-written film. Like always with George Romero, the metaphors are really on the nose, but that's never bothered me in film. I actually really like it when it's easy to get what the filmmakers are saying, but the deeper you look into it, the more meaning you get out of the experience. Basically, I don't think every metaphor, allegory, or symbolism in a film has to be subtle to work. There is a certain subsection of people on this platform that will tell you that movies are better if they are apolitical, but they've clearly never seen a George Romero film. And just to be clear, I'm not even talking about the fact that the main character is black. He was not written to be a black man, so all the themes around racial injustice were essentially just a happy accident. I'm saying even if you take out those elements of the film, it's still hyper-political. But I understand that I'm mostly preaching to the choir here, so let's move on. The Blair Witch Project is on this list for a couple of different reasons. I vividly remember seeing it for the first time as the second part of a double feature with the original Evil Dead. It was my first time seeing both films, and it was a very impactful evening for me. A lot of other films on this list I found exciting, atmospheric, or even disturbing, but the Blair Witch Project actually scared me in a way that I hadn't been scared by a movie before. After finishing that movie, every puff of wind, every creak of the floorboards, or whatever noise was coming from the street outside my window made me look over my shoulder. Found footage is still my favorite subgenre of horror because of how effective I think it is when it's done right. The other reason why I felt like I needed to include this on the list is how into the lore of the Blair Witch Project I got. I knew the film was fake when I saw it, but I still liked buying into the fantasy of it being real. I watched the supplemental mockumentary Curse of the Blair Witch, and I started going online to read fan theories. I've never been this type of fan with any other media, but for some reason the mythology of the Blair Witch Project really spoke to me. I think it also speaks to how creative this film was on such a low budget, but also how well marketed it was. Once again, this is another film where the making of it really fascinated me. I've never really had aspirations to create my own films, but it was still very inspiring to me, if that makes sense. Like, if these guys could go out into the woods and create one of the most important independent films of all time, I could also possibly someday create something people care about. It isn't lost on me that these last three films, The Last House on the Left, Night of the Living Dead, and The Blair Witch Project, are all independent films that crossed into the mainstream. Indie horror is the backbone of this channel, as I've now built my very small brand on recommending lesser-known films. It's interesting that I can trace that love for independent horror films all the way back to when I was first getting into the genre. Shutter felt like a really obvious pick for this list. Like, it was one of the first films I wrote down, but then I had a little bit of a hard time formulating why. It's just a really good, sad ghost story, and I really like those. I know I haven't been recommending a lot of ghost movies on this channel, but that's because a lot of the ones that are coming out right now, I feel like they're missing that sadness that is such a key to making a good ghost story work. Mike Flanagan is one current filmmaker that I think really understands this, and he's able to tell some fantastic ghost stories. This film is just really scary, but the best part of the movie is figuring out the mystery of why this couple is being haunted. When you finally make it to the reveal, it's so dark you almost wish you could forget it, like you shouldn't have been so damn curious. If you haven't been able to tell, I have quite a fondness for really depressing movies, and this certainly fits into that category. So yeah, I don't have like a ton of personal stories about this one or insights. It's just a film I saw pretty early on that I thought was really good. I hear people bring up Ringu, Ju-on the Grudge, and their American remakes all the time, but people don't talk about this one as much, and I think it's a shame. It's easily just as good as those films, in my opinion. The Beyond represents my love for classic Italian horror. I was thinking about putting Suspiria on here, but I feel like that would be a little disingenuous, since it was technically the first Italian horror film I ever saw, but I didn't quite get the appeal feel of it then. The Beyond was the film that made everything click for me. I've said the word atmosphere a lot in this video, and that's because that's the main thing I gravitate towards with horror movies. In this thing, The Beyond, it's all vibes. The director of this film, Lucio Fulci, is a legend amongst fans of Italian horror because he knew exactly the type of movie he was making. He cared about all the shit you needed to care about. The special effects, the elaborate death scenes, and iconic imagery. He was far less concerned with plot or coherent storylines. This makes the worst of his films barely comprehensible, and the best of his films, like The Beyond, beautiful nightmares. It also helps when the movies have really simple setups, like this one. It's about a woman who inherits a hotel, which she learns sits on top of a portal to hell. After that, a bunch of crazy shit involving the undead happens, and you don't need a lot more than that to make a great scary film. As the film progresses, it gets more and more bizarre to the point where at the end, you're not even sure what you're looking at. This spiral into madness, or down to hell in this case, I guess, it's such a compelling concept to me. I've always really liked it when movies start off fairly normal before diving headfirst into surrealism. To me, this is the most entertaining movie on the list. It's one of my all-time favorite films. There's another Fulci film called City of the Living Dead, which I also like a whole bunch. I wanted to pick something really fun for the last entry on this list, and you can't get much more fun than the Slumber Party Massacre. It's a ridiculously over-the-top 80s slasher that was made deliberately so, as a bit of a goof on the genre. It's very meta in a way that was very ahead of its time. It's goofy and dumb in a lot of the ways you expect it to be, but it's also clearly made to be just that. It satirizes the stereotypes and tropes often used by generic 80s slasher movies, and it came out in 1982, long before the slasher craze was over. I went into this expecting a so bad it's good film, but it's legitimately a really funny comedy and a very entertaining slasher film all at once. It manages to create a really iconic killer with the Driller Killer, even though he's not even wearing a mask. Nowadays, the feminist message of the slasher killer just looking like a regular guy stalking teenage girls is pretty obvious, but at the time it went over a lot of people's heads. I also want to give a shout out to Slumber Party Massacre 2, which is one of the most ridiculous films I've ever seen. They turned the Driller Killer into a rockabilly dude with a guitar that's also a drill. It's one of the most bonkers things you'll ever see in your entire life, and I think that's a good time you owe to yourself. That's it for the list today. There's obviously tons of more stuff I could get into that's been fundamental to me, but these were the 10 films I felt like were worth highlighting in terms of what I do on this channel here. But it still kind of feels crazy, you know, there wasn't a single Carpenter film, there wasn't a Mario Bava film or an Argento film. So many filmmakers got left out. David Cronenberg as well, right? All these directors that I love, but I only had 10 spots on the list. But yeah, I'm still quite pleased with it. Please consider liking, subscribing, as I said before, and I have a bunch of other stuff going on. I'm on TikTok now, which a link to that is in the description. I'm talking about every episode of Tales from the Dark Side, so I'm going on there, watching an episode, and then reviewing it really quick in like the TikTok format, and then once I'm done with the first season of that, I'll probably make a YouTube video about it. I got other stuff coming in the pipeline as well, more updates to the series I'm doing regarding underrated modern horror film, and then we're going to do a video on found footage, sort of follow up to my big ranking of found footage movies, because I got a bunch of recommendations for like obscure found footage movies that I want to get to. So that's kind of coming in the pipeline. And yeah, thanks for watching. I'll talk to you guys in the comments, and I'll see you guys later. All right, bye.